It's a great pleasure to introduce the highly respected Graeme Samuel, who will speak to us today about airports. Graeme has far too many accomplishments to name, so I'll highlight just a few. He's a professor at Monash University's Business School and president of Dementia Australia. A former lawyer and investment banker, Graeme has held a number of high-profile roles, including former chairman of competition watchdog the ACCC, where he introduced criminal sanctions for cartels, among many other things. In 2010, he was made a Companion of the Order of Australia. And in the past few weeks, he's been particularly busy, notably for his APRA-appointed role to investigate and report on the Commonwealth Bank's governance and culture. It was an outstanding report that didn't pull any punches. Besides giving an insight into the inner workings of the bank, it's a document that should be used by corporate Australia on what not to do. But today he will talk about airports in his capacity as chairman of Airlines in Australia and New Zealand, an alliance of airlines who joined forces to fight infrastructure constraints, high taxes, and other matters of aviation policy. The report has already caused a stir, and I'm sure his speech today will give us some food for thought. Thank you, Graeme.
Well, thanks, Adele, and thank you to Mark Baker and the Melbourne Press Club for the invitation to speak here today. Can I also offer a very special welcome and a thank you for coming down here, and that is to John Borghetti, the CEO of the major sponsor, Virgin. John has already told me he will be leaving a little bit early. He's got to catch a flight. I've told him just to delay the flight, but he said he can't do quite that. So he said he will try and time it when I don't say something offensive about Virgin, which I can assure him we won't do. Well, I am delighted here to be able to speak about one of my favourite topics, my intense dislike for monopolies. Never liked them, I never will, and nor should any of you here, except if you're a monopolist, because as I said to John Fain this morning, he asked the question in the promo of an appearance I made on his program, and he said, why don't monopolies act for the public? I said, well, why should they? There's no incentive to do so. Monopolists act solely for themselves. And then he tried to sort of expand the public there to include superannuation funds and the like. I said, look, as far as airports are concerned, the public are the millions of people going through the airports every day. They're the airlines, they're those that fly on the airlines, they're the retail operators, those that buy from them. They're the thousands of taxis that are sitting in the taxi rank waiting to take you from the airport or to bring you there, as the case may be. That's the public, and that's the people that we should be there to serve as corporations. That's what competition makes you to do. But if you're a monopolist, you don't have any regard to the public. Your sole regard is to yourself. So as a former competition regulator at the ACCC, I learned a few things, but one is for certain. Monopolies had the power to and invariably gouge their customers. Therefore, it shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone to hear yesterday that Australia's monopoly airports are earning excessive profits. Yes, they are. It certainly wouldn't have been a surprise to market analysts who note that airport profit margins are growing and will continue to do so at an even higher rate than they've done historically. I spoke about this yesterday when Airlines for Australia and New Zealand, of which I have the privilege to be chair, launched this report into the performance and impact of Australia's airports since privatisation just towards the end of the last century. While fiercely competitive, the partners of A4ANZ have brought together the airlines over shared policy challenges. In this case, they're issues dealing with the monopoly airports in the current regulatory environment. You can see the members that make up A4ANZ in the booklet that's in front of you, and I invite you to look at it, not the least of which I'm going to refer to a couple of slides that will be in it in a few moments. They cover both full-service and low-cost carriers in Australia and New Zealand, and you can see them there in New Zealand, Jetstar, Qantas, Regional Express, the major regional airline, Tiger Air and Virgin. In forming A4ANZ last year, we brought Australia and New Zealand into line with equivalent international bodies. These do exist in America, the Airlines for America, and also in Europe, the Airlines for Europe. We have representatives from our membership here today, including the Press Club's principal sponsor, Virgin Australia. And so, back to the topic at hand. Despite the airport's claims that their charges are reasonable, that's what you'd expect a monopolist to say, to cover costs, the evidence suggests otherwise. If you go to page 6 in that report that you've got, I'll refer to just 2 or 3 of these slides. Independent analysis undertaken by the highly reputable Frontier Economics economic firm confirms that the airports are using their monopoly position to earn excessive profits. Have a look there at the coloured identification of the 4 major airports in Australia, that is Brisbane, Melbourne, Perth and Sydney, and compare those with some of those throughout the world. Have a look also at Auckland Airport. Auckland and Sydney are in a competition as to who can be the most excessive in their profit earning capacity. But compare that with some of the other airports that have got some competition and the profitability is sitting much lower down the line. Over the past decade, Australia's airport margins have grown significantly higher, in some cases more than double than those of airports around the world operating in competitive markets or with greater regulation. I know the ACCC wouldn't have been surprised by this finding either. As part of the light-handed regulatory model under which our airports operate, the ACCC's airport monitoring reports, which I used to treat with disdain when we produced them every year that I was chairman, and I think Rod Sims probably feels the same way, those reports documented the fact that the major airports are now collecting over 25% more revenue for each passenger, that's on a per passenger basis, than 10 years ago in real terms. As you can see if you have a look at page 5 of the report and also on the infographic that you've been received as part of the reports themselves. Have a look also at the graph there that shows what has occurred in relative terms to airport charges and airfares in real terms. And then I was asked by a journalist yesterday, if you had reasonable airport charges, what would it have done to airfares? And if you can have a look at the competitive position that applies to airfares at the bottom of that graph, which is figure 1, you'll see there that airfares would inexorably have gone lower as the competition forced them lower, but there are certain base costs that are in there that really causes the bed, if you like, or the position that the foundation, but that forces the fares to remain at certain levels and not go any lower. You can see these increases have occurred while all fares have been declining in real terms by over 40%. Also at the same time, passenger numbers have increased by nearly 20%, delivering an even bigger revenue boost for airports. Yet, and this is the critical part, the ACCC found no commensurate increase in overall quality. You know, I used to sit there year after year after year and read the survey reports of the quality of the airports. And having used them a fair bit, I was actually a bit bemused that a couple of them got good when I thought they were rather rubbish. But it was quite fascinating. You read these reports, and the survey reports, I have to say, are quite superficial in the way they're conducted. But here it is, year after year after year, satisfactory or maybe in a couple of cases good. But you'd expect with the increasing charges that have been levied that you'd actually get very good or excellent in terms of the service. Not with monopolists. Monopolists don't have any incentive to provide anything other than a barely satisfactory or satisfactory to barely good quality of service. Well, should we be surprised by this or even shocked? Well, frankly, it's become part of our passenger experience to park our car at expensive car parks. I was just reading statistics before that parking at the Sydney airport for a day costs significantly more than to fly Jetstar or Tiger Air from Sydney to Melbourne or Sydney to Avalon. And to park at the airport for the day is almost double the cost of flying from Sydney to Avalon. Can you believe it? And actually the pilots are probably slightly more qualified than the operators of the boom gate. And you walk through shiny new facilities at the airport that are revenue generating. Think of Terminal 3, the Virgin Terminal at Melbourne Airport. Magnificent new retail facilities that are there. Beautiful floors, glossy, kept absolutely spotlessly clean. Magnificent retail areas. Why? Because they are generating rental. And then go to the experience in the bathrooms and other parts of the airports which are far less glamorous. I experienced this recently. I'm going to do this because Virgin's here. I got off the plane coming from Sydney to Melbourne. I walked down the concourse of the Virgin Terminal, felt a need to go to the toilet, so I went into the public toilet. I walked out and rang Jane McKeon, who's a member of the board of Airlines for Australia and New Zealand. And I said to her, Jane, who runs this toilet? Who manages it? And she said, the fact you've got to ask shows the problem because it's in the Virgin Terminal managed by Melbourne Airport. I said, well, I'm telling you now that someone owes me for a pair of shoes because I've thrown my shoes out. They are so dirty. And I've worn the spare pair that is in my briefcase. So that's the sort of problem we got. And a poor old Virgin cops the blame because people think it's their terminal, but no, they don't manage the terminal, it's managed by the Melbourne Airport. It's not profitability alone, however, that demonstrates unconstrained market power. In fact, the absence of excessive profits does not mean market power doesn't exist. A reported 60% of the regional airports, Australian Airports Association tells us, are running at a loss. Yet they're still able to exercise their market power in other ways. At both city and regional airports, aspects such as a lack of consultation on capital works, including the cost of implementation of capital works, which then result in increased charges, is an example of market power. You can see that illustrated on the infographic that you've got that's been slipped in with the booklets. While investment is necessary given growth, A4ANZ believes it must be fit for purpose, aligned with the needs of the passengers using the facilities and demands for air services. Australia has numerous examples of what the International Air Transport Association, IATA, and the Airports Council International, ACI, guidelines would rate as over-design, such as creating international airports or additional capacity for larger planes where there is little current or predicted demand, or simply not ensuring that the existing asset is being used most effectively, which may be achieved through more modest increases in operational expenditure. Let me say to you, the vast bulk of our regional airports are actually gifted by the federal government to local councils some years ago as part of the process of, in a sense, sort of quasi-privatisation. In so many of those airports, local mayors, local councils have decided to gold plate them and to create facilities. One was related to us by one of our board members yesterday, John Sharp, former Minister for Transport. And he said in one particular instance, money was spent extending the runway, building the terminal to cater for 280 passengers on the basis that what it was going to do was to be able to cater for big airlines to come in there. The only aircraft flying in there at the time of the expansion was the Sabre 340, which takes 34 passengers. The only aircraft that now lands or takes off at that airport is the Sabre 340, which takes 34 passengers, yet they've spent the money gold plating. This situation has arisen because Australia's airports are indisputably monopoly operators and as such are able to use their market power to set prices that exceed costs and have no incentive to consult on capital works that result in increased charges. Regulation is of course intended to ameliorate these effects. However, the current light-handed regulatory regime for Australian airports, which effectively is ACCC monitors the four major airports, Brisbane, Perth, Sydney and Melbourne, and then the others have absolutely no regulatory oversight at all. That was built around a premise that just because airports have market power doesn't mean they will use or abuse it. Whoever dreamt that must have been smoking something at the time, because monopolists always use and abuse their market power. They have no disincentive to do otherwise. I put it to you that this is simply not the case, and a couple of examples I'll give will demonstrate this clearly. Who other than a monopolist operator would park a car behind a plane, an escort car? The plane was forced to land, by bad weather, was forced to land at Canberra Airport rather than where its passengers wanted to go, and the pilot, which was Sydney. So it had to land at Canberra Airport. It was a safety diversion. And then the car was parked behind the plane so that it couldn't back away from the air bridge to be able to take off. And the airport demanded that the airline, through the pilot initially, pay by Visa card an $18,000 fee because it had landed at the airport. Now, who could get away with that? Hey, go to Harvey Norman, have a bad experience with a salesman. Will you ever go back again? Of course not. You'll go to JP or to Good Guys or to Better Electric or whatever it is. But what choice has Virgin or Qantas got than to go to Canberra Airport when people want to land there, or to Sydney Airport when people want to land there or take off from there? So that's in the public domain, and yes, it happened in Canberra, not in a developing country. As I said yesterday, you might expect it in a third world country, but hardly in the airport of the nation's capital. And who else but a monopolist airport owner, in this case Perth, would block an airline, Qantas, from operating a route to Johannesburg because, in their words, and I quote them, another airline had the route covered. South African Airways, they said, it's got the route covered, so we don't need Qantas to actually fly that route. That's frankly anti-competitive action, and clearly those of a monopolist, and you might even think that certain people at the ACCC regulator might have some thoughts about that sort of process. So forgive me for laughing when I'm told by bureaucrats and the Airports Association that as big businesses, the airlines can go away and negotiate commercial agreements fairly with the airports. That is a nonsense. Airports' monopoly status gives them a natural bargaining advantage over their customers. And that's not just the airlines, but other airport users like car rental companies, retailers, who, by the way, in some of the airports are paying rents much higher than they would pay at an equivalent location in a Westfield shopping centre. That can lead to some of the following behaviours. Adopt a take it or leave it position, but it's not take it or leave it because Virgin, Qantas can't leave it. It has to land at Canberra, it has to land at Sydney or Hobart or Launceston, and so it's a take it. You have no choice. Airports delaying or refusing to disclose necessary background information or material facts, thus delaying settlement. In other ways, protracting negotiations, developing agreements that fail to provide contractual certainty or lack clarity and transparency. Using media to put pressure on airlines to accept deals. We've certainly seen that in Canberra in recent times where they've accused the airlines of cancelling too many flights. Hey, listen, if I was dealing with with the likes of a Canberra airport, I'd be actually sort of really wondering why it is that I've got to fly there to be treated in the derisory manner that Qantas pilot and airline was treated when they had to land there for safety reasons. You can't take off until you give me your Visa card, Mr. Pilot, and charge $18,000 to it for the privilege of landing at our airport. And then withdrawing unrelated services during negotiations and disputes. I heard a story yesterday from one of our airline members of a certain airport blocking the entry to their lounge in the middle of a dispute. So the picture I've painted is not pretty, and it's the consumer who's ultimately the loser in all this. So A4ANZ's efforts are not just about trying to balance the ledger. A vibrant aviation sector will drive efficiency and innovation, which in turn is good for consumers and the economy. It's clear, however, that one part of the sector is capturing the majority of the benefits that this growth brings. Let me say also, by the way, and we just got this morning a response by the Australian Airports Association to the report that we've issued and some of the discussion that occurred yesterday. And I'd invite them to actually have a bit of a think about their process of dealing with the issues that we're talking about. The first thing was they actually didn't dispute any of the material that was in our report. So I'll take that as an endorsement of what's in the report. The second thing was that they produced some other facts which cherry-picked the statistics. We've all heard, what is it, statistics, more damn statistics and lies, right? Well, what they did was they took a particular period of time, 2 years, and failed to note that there had been changes that occurred in the most recent year. So I invite the Airports Association to actually start getting their facts up to date and right. But the worst part about it was this. They said, yeah, all right, we're monopolists, but these guys, Virgin and Qantas, they're duopolists. Well, actually, they're not, they're quadrupolists because there's Tiger Air and Jetstar as well. But they're duopolists, and therefore that's just as bad as monopolists. Well, forgive me, but if I asked John Borghetti or Alan Joyce whether they're competing with each other vigorously, I think they'd have to say that they're competing with it. And look, go onto the website and look at your fares each day and see the competition that's occurring between the two and the fact that they're all vying to get business travellers, they're vying to get your business with Tiger Air and Jetstar, etc. Really vigorous competition. You want a comparison about vigorous competition, have a look in most recent years at Woolworths and Coles. Admittedly, duopolists, substantial market share. But by golly, I reckon that the CEOs of each of those operators are saying to themselves, if only we could halt or slow down the aggressive competition. John Durkin in this morning's Financial Review, the current CEO of Coles, said, if only we could stop this whole concept of down, which he started, and the vigorous competition that is there in terms of price. So don't let anyone, and particularly the Airports Association, I know there's some people from some of the airports here, don't let them ever convince you that a duopoly is as bad as a monopoly. Duopolists can be, in this country, just as vigorous competitors as you will get in any environment at all. Well, what do we do about this? Well, the current regulatory model under which the airports operate is, by the ACCC's own words, limited in its ability to address behaviour that's detrimental to consumers. In particular, it does not provide the ACCC with a general power to intervene in the airport's setting of terms and conditions of access to the airport's infrastructure. Let me repeat that. It does not provide the ACCC with the general power to intervene in the airport's setting of terms and conditions of access to the airport's infrastructure. That's the problem. When you've got a monopoly, there are only two things that can bring a monopoly to account. One is the threat of competition, the other is the threat of regulation. It will not happen in this country that with our 151 airports, you'll get competition. The cost of an airport is just such, the capital cost of the infrastructure is such, you're not going to get two airports competing with each other, particularly in your major capital cities, let alone in regional Australia. So forget the threat of competition. You need then the threat of regulation. That does not mean regulation in the form of price caps or controls by a regulator over whatever it is that is agreed between major customers of airports, rental car companies, taxi companies, hire car companies, retail operators and the airlines. There is no way that we would advocate that level of control, but there is a process that should be available whereby airports can say at a particular time, we'd better be reasonable because if not, the ACCC will be brought in to arbitrate in the process. That used to be the case. I was chair of the ACCC when Virgin said to Sydney Airport, we don't like what you're putting to us. And there was no way Virgin could negotiate otherwise on its landing charges. And therefore it sought a declaration of the airside services of Sydney Airport, and ultimately after about 6 years it got the High Court to agree that declaration should occur. Then it was a quick process. Virgin came to the ACCC and said to us, we've got a dispute with Sydney Airport. We can't resolve it. And the ACCC sat down, I was chair at the time, and started to sort this issue out. And we were just about ready to arbitrate in the dispute. And a very interesting thing happened. At 10 p.m, the night before we were due to issue our arbitration, Sydney Airport, Virgin and Qantas said, we've reached an agreement. It's all done. They knew that there was a real danger, particularly the airport knew that there was a real danger that the ACCC would arbitrate in a manner that they didn't want. So agreement was reached. So this is what we think is necessary in Australia today. That process of arbitration that occurred back in 2003 to 2006 and thereabouts is too long, too complex, and now because of amendments that were made to the competition law in November last year is no longer available. If Virgin has a dispute with an airport, it can no longer go to the ACCC and say, please arbitrate. Just not possible. It's been taken out of the books. So what we're recommending is to government is that there be a very minor legislative amendment to the Airports Act that essentially says any airport in Australia, it doesn't matter whether it's regional, Wagga Wagga, Dubbo, Townsville, whatever it is, or a Tier 2 domestic airport, Hobart, Launceston, Adelaide or the like, or the major ones, the four I've mentioned before. If there's a dispute that is, if the airport has market power over the services it's offering, and we all know they have market power over the airside services, the tarmacs and the like. We know they have market power over the retail areas. We know they have market power over where rental car companies are able to put their booths. We know they have market power over their car parks. We know they have market power over how the taxis operate, right? And we can talk about taxis in a few moments if you like, but we know all that. And so where they've got market power, then what ought to be put in place is a mechanism whereby the ACCC can intervene. There's one final rub on that, which I'm going to suggest to you, and for the lawyers here, it'll be, I think, something to think about a bit later on. Arbitration normally involves two parties coming along to the arbitrator, in this case the ACCC, and saying, here's my position. The other party says, here's my position. And then the ACCC sits down and says, well, what is the position going to be? And it'll arbitrate, it'll try and bring it somewhere in between. We think there's a better process than that, which has been adopted in the US and in Canada, particularly in the sporting arena. It's called last offer arbitration, final offer arbitration. Very simple process. The ACCC says to Virgin and to a particular airport, 1st of June, put in your final offer. That's it. You're locked in, final offer at that stage. The ACCC then looks at both final offers of the airport and Virgin and then says, okay, we'll pick one or other. That's it. No choice. We'll pick one or other. We might pick clause 1 of one offer, clause 2 of another, clause 3, 4 and 5 of another offer and just put them together. That'll be the only way it'll happen. Guess what that does? The parties that were sitting out here think if I sit out there forever, the ACCC will ignore me, particularly the other party has come to the centre. I better come to the centre myself. And as they get closer and closer together, they get to a point where they turn around and say, what's the point of going to the ACCC to arbitrate? We might as well reach an agreement because we're so close together in any event. That's the beauty of that form of regulation. It is not something that over-regulates. It's not something that actually brings about regulation. It is the ultimate process of bringing a monopolist to accountability, and that is the threat of regulation. So this process is something that we have put to government, and we're hoping the government might deal with, particularly in the context of the Productivity Commission review into airports that is taking place in the not-too-distant future. The members of A4ANZ are committed to building, maintaining and improving positive, constructive relationships with airports. We also want to see airports and the whole aviation sector prosper. It's not only in the airlines' interest, but it's in their passengers' interest, as well as the interests of Australian tourism and export sectors and the broader economy for this to occur. I'm hoping that the processes now being adopted by Airlines for Australia and New Zealand will actually bring about some common sense on the part of the airports. Thank you.
First thing I'd like to ask you, I don't want any details on why you had to throw out your shoes, given it's lunch.
It's one word, begins with S and begins with T, ends with T.
Did you get a refund?
No, I didn't. Well, of course, I'd have to go to Melbourne Airport, and I don't think Melbourne Airport would actually welcome it at the moment. I was actually thinking after I'd raised the issue of Canberra Airport yesterday and the issue of the car blocking the aircraft from backing out to be able to take off. And I was wondering whether when I got to the security desk there, they insisted on doing a full body search, but it didn't happen. But
You were the former ACCC chairman. You would have seen report year after year about what's going on with the airports. Why has there been such light touch regulation for years when we know what's going on?
John Sharp actually, yesterday, the former Minister for Transport, made, I thought, a really unusual confession and apology. And he said he brought about privatisation. He said he didn't put in place the proper regulatory environment for a period of years, 5 years. There were price caps and price controls. And that was in total breach of the Hilmer competition policy agreements that were entered into between the states and the Commonwealth back in 1995, and I was involved in the National Competition Council at that period of time. And what that said was, if you're going to privatise a monopoly, a government monopoly, you've got to put in place the right controls or the right structures to ensure that the monopoly doesn't continue in private hands. John admitted yesterday and apologised. He did apologise. He said, I didn't deal with it properly. So for 5 years they had really heavy-handed price control regulation, not so much service control, by the way, and then they decided that they would lighten it. The Productivity Commission said, I thought rather strangely, look, let the monopolists work this through. They'll deal with it in a sensible way. Well, we said year after year in 3 successive Productivity Commission reviews, you're wrong. We've got the evidence to show you that you're wrong. Don't repeat the mistake. And they kept repeating it with a minor change in 2010 in the final report they did while I was chair. But a minor change there, which was never taken up by government. I think it's now accepted by both, I hope by the Productivity Commission, but certainly by government, that there's a problem. It's got to be dealt with. Look, you cannot have constant complaints about car park charges. You can't go to an airport. We've all experienced this. How many times have you been to the 2 major airports, Sydney and Melbourne, and stood in a 50 to 100 metre queue waiting for a taxi? As former taxi regulator in this place, in this city, I know that sitting over in the holding yard is between 700 and 1,000 taxis, all waiting to come out to try and pick us up. Yet you stand in a 50 or 100 metre queue waiting for up to 20 to 25 minutes to get a taxi. That can't happen. It's just, but why should it be any different? Yeah, why change the service? Why change the circumstance where if you go to Melbourne Airport, you know, the other day, well, more and more people now being dropped off at the 1 minute drop off down below because getting up the ramp is just so slow and so difficult. the sort of things, I'm seeing people nod, they all know this experience. I hope you haven't thrown your shoes out as well because it'd have been an expensive process going to the toilet. But, you go up those departure lanes and you say to yourself, why? Why can't something be done? And it's been done in Sydney Airport. You go to Sydney Airport, much busier airport, you don't have those sort of hold-ups as you go to either Virgin or Qantas departure lanes. But for some reason in this city, when you go there, the departure lanes can be blocked up as much as 300 or 400 metres back before you even get to the lights of Airport Drive to be able to get up there. So what's wrong? Why is it? And yet, as is shown by these graphs, Melbourne and Sydney are earning excessive profits, and others as well. I was asked this morning about Perth, and I said, well, Perth is less egregious, only marginally so. Look at Auckland Airport. We're over there the other day, Alistair and myself, to have a look at in terms of Auckland Airport. It was described to us, it's the major airport in New Zealand, as a national disgrace. I relayed that to ministers and all, and they picked that up and they're worried about it. But do you know, in Auckland, the monopolist there is by statute authorised to charge whatever it deems fit. The statute says you can charge whatever price you deem fit to the airlines. And guess what? There is no contract in New Zealand between the airline and the airport that says this is the service quality you shall have. So the airport charges whatever it likes and then provides whatever service it feels like providing. Give me a break. I mean, I don't understand it.
And as we know, tourists, the first impression they have when they arrive somewhere is the airport. So how is it allowed to go on like this? And can you give us some examples of, besides the shoes, other poor service?
Well, yeah, look, I remember when I was chair of the Taxi Services Commission here in Victoria, and we raised with the airport, not, I have to say, under the current CEO, Lyle Stranby, I think, is a much more, how to describe it, reasonable and accessible individual than perhaps his predecessors. But we raised with them, why can't we actually have a link, a telephone link, that puts you in touch with a rental car company? So if you want to, you can actually phone up, get a rental car to pick you up if you come international. It didn't have the room. I said, hey mate, all you got to do is find a little spot on a wall. You had to be able to telephone direct dial. Couldn't be done, wasn't possible. We have taxi drivers who get upset about taking short-term fares. Why not put in a system whereby if you get a short fare, very short one, that you get a tag that says you can come into the front of the queue and come back in. Too difficult, won't do it. So, why does this happen? Well, we don't actually have to try that hard. We don't have to try that hard because, after all, there's nowhere else that Qantas or Virgin can land, so don't bother.
So how do you incentivise a monopolist to improve service when there's no profit for them?
You can't, Adele, you can't incentivise a monopolist because the incentive for any business is normally the threat of competition. I mean, ask Virgin why it improves its service, or Qantas why it keeps its service at high levels, because it knows that the moment it drops its service, then a competitor will step in, right? And we do know that this nation can have two major airlines operating vigorously in competition with each other. We've also, I think, proven time after time we can't have a third airline. They've failed so often it doesn't matter. But we know that competition is the incentive. Competition is the ultimate unforgiving discipline that brings about improvement in quality of service and a lowering of prices and efficiencies on the part of the corporate entity, the provider of the business, to actually operate efficiently, to serve their customers. See, competition is all about meeting the needs of the public, your customers, rather than customers meeting your needs. Right? Monopolists don't have that. So you've got to substitute the second best option, which is a regulatory threat, and say, if you don't do it properly, then what we're going to do is bring a regulator in that'll say, not only these are the prices, but these are the terms and conditions of service, and you've got to meet them. They'll be contractual. And that way we may not have to throw out too many more shoes.
And just, yeah, that's right. And just in terms of price, we know that everybody's getting gouged. You were saying that the airlines get gouged. How does that translate into air tickets? Is there a percentage?
It's a cost. Look, and John's better versed about to answer this than I am, John Baghetti, but it's a cost like your fuel. But see, particularly with the low-cost operators like Tiger Air and Jetstar, the cost of travel between two major cities, Sydney and Melbourne, is really just in double digits. It's in tens of dollars rather than hundreds of dollars. I think today airfares to Avalon, Sydney and Melbourne, I think was something like $49. I think we had about $63, something of that nature, for a travel from Sydney to Melbourne, and that's to Tullamarine Airport. Now you throw into that the very high airport charges, the aeronautical charges for landing and the like, and suddenly you're having a very substantial percentage of those charges comprise the aeronautical charge. That's the airport charge. See those lowered, and what should happen? Well, your fares should lower. That's why I pointed to that particular graph, which I think is the most telling one in the booklets that you've got, that shows airport charges have gone up like that. Airfares, average airfares have gone down like this. Why? Two competitors vigorously competing. Interestingly, with all the airport charges, there's no competitor, so they go up. Now, if those airport charges have been more realistic and have been flat or had been declining, then you'd have expected that the airfare charges, the airfares themselves, would have declined at an even greater rate than the 40% that have been identified in that chart. That's the simple process of competition.
So would you say that we're paying, say, an extra 10% for air tickets?
The problem is that you can't. You've got to relate it to tickets at any point of the day. So if you take a Jetstar Tiger airfare from Sydney to Melbourne that is measured in tens, then you could be talking much, much higher percentages than 10. I haven't got the numbers, but you could be talking very, very high percentages. On the other hand, if you're talking about a business class fare that's $1,000 or $700 or $800, it'll be a lower percentage. So I don't think we can simplify it in that fashion.
Right. And just one last question, then I'll open it up to the floor. Do you think you'll get... This report has had a lot of publicity. Hopefully it's got the right attention. Are you getting much traction in Canberra, and how does the ACCC feel about it?
I don't want to speak for Rod because it's for him to speak to himself, but we have had discussions with him. We've talked to the Productivity Commission. We've talked obviously to ministers and to shadow ministers, and I think it's fair to say that on no occasion has any of them said, look, go away, this is laughable, you're not making sense. They're all saying, look, this is really interesting evidence. It's been backed up by Frontier Economics, which is, I think, one of the most respected economics firms, not only here but internationally. And so they're saying, we better look at this, we better start listening to it. I think there's a general recognition, Adele, that the light-handed monitoring process is not working. I remember back when I was with the ACCC, we brought in a senior economist to look at the issue of monitoring, price monitoring, what it was worth. There was one slide I'll never forget. It was his final slide in the lead up to all the information he provided. And he said, I'll tell you what monitoring does. He says, in one slide, he said, it satisfies the political desire to be seen to be doing something. Full stop, nothing else.
Jane Nathan, former Commissioner and Administrator of Brimbank City Council. Now, I've really enjoyed, Graeme, what you have said, and Adele, you indicated that we've got a problem at Melbourne Airport, and I will catch on to the words you used, Graeme, with access and competition, and the rail link to the airport is a no-brainer. In 1990s, reports came through and millions of dollars have been spent on doing reports on that airport link through Sunshine to the city. Now we have regional rail and it brings in Ballarat, Bendigo, Geelong, through Sunshine. We've got the airport not only as people flying in and out but working there. That competition with regard to road space and public transport and the money that people have to pay for the car, is that something that comes under the ACCC or can be taken because politics seem to be the area that it breaks down, Graeme?
Look, I'd love to be able to think that the ACCC had the power to actually direct something to be done, but it doesn't. What the ACCC does is it looks at any industry, at any market and says, have we got competition? If we have, let's make sure that the competitors don't collude or act, and to use the fairly nonsensical description of the Airports Association, they don't act as a duopoly that are colluding to try and limit capacity or to raise prices. I mean, I really say to the AAA, the Australian Airports Association, you've got to have something better than that, guys. Otherwise, it really is going to be laughable. But that's an aside. But the issue is this: is that the ACCC can't force more competition. What it can do is ensure that if you've got competition, it'll be maintained, that it won't be distorted by participants in the competitive market colluding or price fixing or whatever the case might be. Look, we'd all love to see something different to be able to get to the airport than what we have at the present time. The federal government has announced prepared to put $5 billion in. Now we're going to have a debate for the next 5 or 10 years about what the route will be. Good luck. This is the way it happens, unfortunately, and airlines sit there and there's nothing much they can do about it. The airports have got a bit of a conflict of interest because, of course, the more people use the train, the less people use the car parks. And that's not suggesting, I'm not suggesting the Melbourne Airport, or I wouldn't do that, but it just simply to say there is a conflict of interest, and so we'll have to wait and see how far things actually go in that area in terms of the rail link it probably won't be in my lifetime, but it might be in yours.
Ian Kramer, I'm just a private businessman. I find it interesting that you're talking about both competition and regulation. They're the opposite thing to me. If you regulate or arbitrate and reduce profit margins, the natural outcome is that the business is going to reduce service levels, especially when they're owned by Macquarie Bank and super funds and things like this who are there because of profit. So how are you going to keep the standard of the toilet up and improve it by reducing the profit margin? And isn't the fact that you're talking about competition really should be pushing towards building more private airports to compete as opposed to regulation?
Well, first of all, competition and regulation are not at opposite ends. What they are is regulation has to step in where competition fails. You use it for market failure or for circumstances where competition can't exist. Now, good luck to you if you can persuade a whole lot of people to build a whole lot of private airports, but given the billions of dollars involved, I'd have a real question mark as to whether they actually can succeed. You've got Avalon Airport, and you can speak to the Fox family about how difficult it's been to get airlines to land there. They've just got AirAsia, I think, has agreed to land there. But I mean, it's there. But what are we going to do? We're going to subsidise it. So you're nodding. Thank you very much. But I'll prefer my dollars not to be going into subsidising. I've got enough to pay for new shoes. So I don't want to be subsidising private businesses to build new airports. What I do want to do, though, is to put in place regulation that says this. Not only are your prices excessive, I didn't say that they should be taken away or they shouldn't earn profits, but rather that the prices ought to be brought to reasonable levels and at the same time, remember, impose service quality standards. Now, you can do both. That's what any business had to do. Ask Coles and Woolworths, acting as an aggressive competitors, right? And Coles had it down, and Woolworths had to meet it. But what you've seen at the same time is Coles and Woolies saying, okay, our prices are not far apart. What we're going to have to do now is provide better stores, better stock selection, have stock on the shelves, have better checkout arrangements and all. They've put the investment into that because they know that the customer not only wants low prices, but wants better quality service. Airports don't have that incentive. So what they've got is they can say, we only have to provide a service that barely gets us through. We can charge whatever we like because there's no one there to stop us. We can charge rentals higher than Westfield charges at its shopping centres because no one there to stop us, right? Forces the retail operators to charge you for your water and your sandwich a lot more than would otherwise be the case, right? Because they've got very high rental charges. Now, I don't want to subsidise the airports in terms of these things. They're earning excessive profits. What I will say, though, is that ACCC has got the ability to be able to determine what is the appropriate level of profitability in an efficient environment. We do that all the time as regulators. And more importantly, what is the appropriate level of service that we expect from them? I'd love to see a report each year that says the level of service being offered by the airports is very good, because that's what we deserve as travelling public.
Any other questions?
One at the back.
Simon Feely, Graeme. You mentioned John Sharp in your address and his apology. I wonder if he might also apologise about a mistake in privatising, or not privatising, but monopolising regional airports, in splitting dual travel to regional airports and thus elevating the airfares to almost unacceptable levels. And I note also that John is on the board of Regional Express.
Yeah, he's Deputy Chairman of Regional Express on the board of Airlines for Australia and New Zealand. I don't know what he's got to apologise about. I mean, say to anyone in regional Australia, we're going to take away your airport, and thus the primary means of people getting to a particular city or a particular region, and there'd be a complete uproar. What he did was, he said, look, let's take them off the federal government's books. Let's hand them over to local councils. Let them deal with them. They know best what's required in the region concerned. They know the level of service that's required, and they know the charges that ought to be able to be imposed. The problem is there's no oversight, there's no accountability. In fact, one of the big problems is that you have no transparency. See, 60% of these airports say they're losing money. John's leaving because he has to leave, not because I've said anything about regional airports, but they're losing money, they say. The Australian Airport Association quotes 60% of them losing money. Well, I can give you two reasons for that, one of which we have no proof or otherwise about, and that is that we don't have any accountability or transparency as to how they're accounting for the revenue of the airports and the costs associated with it, or whether there's some transfer pricing and transfer of costing that's going on. So we have no knowledge about it. But the second thing is this, is that many regional airports are, by their very nature, uneconomic. They're there for a good social reason. It goes to a lot to the social fabric of Australia, and that is regional Australia tends to get subsidised either by state governments, local governments or by federal governments to provide a necessary service for those that live in the regions. You give a local council an airport, so it's given to them for nothing. Right? It's got certain infrastructure there. Then the local council says, let's spend tens of millions extending the runway, whatever it might be. I gave the example before of the runway that was extended. Now, what do? Well, as a monopolist, they don't have to worry. They just simply say the charge will then be imposed on Rex or on Qantas, whoever it is that's servicing it, and that charge then has to be put to passengers. You are right. What it does is that it puts the charges for regional travel largely out of the reach of many people who want to do it. More importantly, it says to a Rex, I actually don't think I can continue to provide that regional service. And you end up either with a monopoly regional service or you end up with no service at all. And let me tell you that John Sharp has publicly said, Rex has said, and others, Virgin and Qantas have said, there are circumstances now looming large where we will not be able to service certain regional areas. They'll have to be serviced by car or by whatever it might be, by bus as the case may be, right? That's what happens when monopolists can run completely unaccountable for, unregulated, no threat of regulation.
Any other questions?
Mitchell Cole, just student at Kilvington. I was wondering why we have the monopoly in Australia and why other countries don't suffer the same kind of deal.
Good question, and it relates to the fact of the size of Australia's geography and the dispersal of its population. And this happens right around this country in so many different areas. We have much higher levels of concentration in our various industries here than will occur in many other places in the world. The population of Australia is a little larger than the population of California. And the population of America is, 300 million plus. So it's over 10 times the size of the population of Australia. Yet our geographic mass is so dispersed that you've got to provide for services to be provided right around the country, but for relatively small populations. That's why we end up having monopolies, because frankly we can't afford to have multiple services operating. Now, in this country we've tried decade after decade to have a third domestic airline. It's failed. I can't even remember their names. What do we have? Compass, and there have been several of them, all of which have failed, including the failure of Ansett. I remember my predecessor at the ACCC, Alan Fell, saying, we've got to save Ansett because we need a third operator. And the way we'll save them is by you and me, all of us, probably not you yet because you're not on any income, but the rest of us are paying taxes, putting in several $100 million to save Ansett and let some private operators take it over. And I railed against this. I thought it was fundamentally wrong, because it seemed to me that it had been demonstrated so often that this country can only afford two airlines operating in vigorous competition, and far better off to have a strong Virgin and a strong Qantas vigorously competing with each other, rather than having a third airline, which would have then destined either Virgin or the third airline to be struggling. Now, in fact, what we've got now is a highly competitive industry that serves us well, subject to the charges that are imposed when you enter the airport. Every step along the way, I've talked about them just with our local airport here, and I won't go into it again, but you've got to say to yourself, why is it that we don't deserve something better?
time for maybe one or two more questions.
Hi, Graeme. Jeff Golden from Telstra. You mentioned in terms of what you would recommend, that you wouldn't recommend price regulation, a price cap or some other mechanism. I'm wondering what the fundamental distinction is that you see between the airports as monopoly infrastructure versus, say, telecommunications as monopoly infrastructure that justifies price regulation in the case of telecommunications but not in the case of airports.
There's a good reason, and that is that when you're dealing with airports, you're dealing with negotiations between groups of parties. So you've got negotiations that will take place with 4 or 5 rental companies, car rental companies. Negotiations take place with maybe, well, it could be 2 or 3 domestic airlines, and then there's about 30 others that are represented by BARA, which is the representative of the major international airlines. You've got retailers who are able to collectively gather together to deal with the negotiations on rental charges and the like. With Telstra, you've got several million users who don't operate as a collective, and therefore you can't have negotiations. Yeah, I can negotiate for my arrangements, but in the end, Telstra used to be able to have a position where it could do what it liked because it was the only operator. Then it got subject to some competition, and we all know the history of that and the battles that some of us had with Sol Trujillo and Phil Burgess and others back in those days. What you're now facing is the impact of competition. And that's good for all of us. Not so good for Telstra, but certainly good for all of us, that you've got a whole lot of competitors coming up that are saying, we can provide a better service at a lower price, and it's something you've never contemplated before. And all I'll say is, I'm delighted at the fact that I can now do a reasonable deal with Telstra and get 90 gig of download all at high speeds. Would never have contemplated that 2 years ago.
Okay, thank you very much, Graeme. Really insightful report. It's painted a picture of, we're really stuck with monopolies.
No, we're not.
But we need to do something about it. Maybe one idea is to have, shaming for poor service is another way to supplement this, having regular surveys that really shame airports when they're really giving substandard service.
I wish you were right, Adele. I'm sorry, I've got to have the last word. I wish you were right, but you've got to remember this. We did these airport reports year after year after year. The only reason they got any publicity was because the airports, one of them, particularly Sydney, said it was going to defend itself. And I used to laugh. Kerry Mather up there, the CEO, used to say, Kerry, you are dumb. No one's got any interest in this other than for car park charges. Don't even bother to try and defend yourself. But she insisted on doing it because she was very sensitive about it. And it lasted for 24 hours in the news cycle, and then it was all gone. So you and I are all very interested in the car park charges. Were it not for the campaign that we're running at the present time and the publicity associated with it, no one would even know what an aeronautical charge is. They wouldn't know its impact on your airfares. They probably grumble about the price of water out at the airport, the bottled water and all, but they don't know it's all to do with rentals and the like. They grumble about the toilets, and yes, 1 or 2 of us throw our shoes out, but in the end, you just think, well, that's what I've got to take. I grumble about the long queues to get up the departure lanes, but I say, well, that's the way it is. What am I going to do about it? Nothing. So it's all over. And I don't think shaming actually achieves anything. You've got to have an enforceable contract between airlines, rental companies, retail operators, taxi companies, hire car companies, you name it, all of which says contractually to the airport, you've got to fix it. Why? Because our customers demand it. That's the fundamental message.
Thank you.